Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And this video is going to be a bit of a follow-up to a previous video that I did with Philip Chase. We were discussing implicit and explicit, conscious and unconscious bias in narrative. And a couple of people have asked, like, why is it important to be aware of this? And there are a number of different reasons. The first is being aware of bias in written work and being aware that there is bias in general in almost all narratives that are written. That is an important sort of baseline, that there is quite often or usually or almost always a bias in how an author has written a world. And it is particularly evident in science fiction and fantasy. So being aware that that is present is basic awareness of how narrative functions. It's one of the fundamentals. So that's one reason. And we'll go into why it's important later, but that is one reason why it is important to know. It is one of the base levels of fiction writing, that some things get imported from the real world into a fictional setting. And what an author chooses to put in or doesn't choose to put in, what an author unconsciously or reflexively includes because that's the way it always is, tells us something about their understanding of the world and our understanding of the world. And the reason I say that is because of the second point. Readers are active participants in the creation and understanding of narrative. An author writes a text, but we as reader interpret it. We decide consciously or unconsciously what information is important, what information we agree with, what information we don't agree with. We decide what has to be emphasized, what has to be de-emphasized. We give meaning to what is on the page. And that is one of the reasons why when we read, what we read on the page, even though they are the exact same words that someone else reads, we can have a radically different interpretation because it is reflective of our understanding. Our understanding is informed by our background and who we are. Our background is obviously informed by our level of education, the culture we come from, how old we are, what sex, gender, sexual orientation, political affiliation, cultural ideologies, all of these things figure into making up who we are. And so how we interpret a text is going to be informed by that. Therefore, understanding how we interpret those things in a text is a way of understanding our own implicit and explicit bias, our own conscious and unconscious biases when we approach things. And so that is a second point for why being able to isolate these things, being able to analyze these things, to pick them apart, it's important because not only does it tell us something about the author, it tells us something about ourselves. And this kind of leads us on to the third point. Quite often when we read or when we consume narrative, be it film or television or any form of narrative, when works conform to our worldview, we tend to be far more accepting and not notice those positions. When works run counter to our worldview, that's when quite often we stop and we argue with the text. And sometimes that is a deliberate thing put in by the author to challenge our expectations. But what is important as a reader is recognizing when we absolutely accept something as normal because we have universalized our experience. We sit here and quite naturally assume that how we see the world is the normal way of seeing the world. We don't think that we look at the world in a weird way. We generally assume that our way of looking at the world, our understanding of the world, is normal. And if a text reaffirms that, quite often we don't notice. It just reaffirms our worldview. And when texts challenge our worldview, that's quite often when we read against the text, when we argue with the text, it can create dissatisfaction in our reading. It's why some people think this text has an agenda, when someone else goes, no, but that text is just accurately reflecting a cultural view. And we get into these arguments. So not only is it about better understanding ourselves, but it's also about understanding why certain texts work for us or don't work for us. And that then leads on to the very last point, which is when we have these challenges to our understanding, it's not that other books don't have exactly the same implicit, explicit, conscious and unconscious biases in them. It's quite often that, yes, those things are there, but because they conform to our worldview, we don't notice. So when we have texts that we go, suddenly, oh, there's all this flurry of all of these texts and they're all doing this thing and this is bad and it's this whole trend. Quite often it's not a trend. It's more that our worldview is now no longer the dominant or predominant worldview in that particular genre at that particular time. So when we read a lot of older texts, quite often, because these texts are older, they have inherently more conservative worldviews. If we are more conservative than the current cultural norm in which texts are being produced, then we might feel that the earlier texts are less political because they're not making political points. But the thing is, they are making political points. They're just political points that we agree with. They are making ideological points. They're just ideological points that conform to our worldview. So it's not that earlier texts don't have politics in them or don't have sociological or ideological positions that they are forwarding, that they are affirming, or that they are deconstructing. It's just that because they conform to our personal approach, quite often we don't notice. And so this is why when we find things that occur in text and we start noticing them more, it's not necessarily that the authors are doing something different. The authors are doing the same thing that authors have always done. But now we find ourselves in a position where our ideologies or worldview is no longer the same as the norm being produced by the authors. And so it's a slightly different point. So to go through some of this and to explain why this is actually an important aspect is, let's start with the idea that readers are active participants. The reason this is important is the text will never change. And as I keep saying, when you read that text at different points in your life, you may feel differently about it. You may notice different things in it. You may, when you are reading, suddenly go, I never noticed the sexism in that before. And that's not that the sexism was never there before. It's more that back when you read it the first time and you didn't notice any of that, that sexism, you didn't notice as sexism because you assumed it was a normal behavior. You just didn't spot it because it didn't appear sexist, but you as a person have changed. So one of the things that is important about this is it gives us understanding of the time in which something is written, an implicit bias that the author may or may not have had, but how it corresponds to our own evolution and our own changing set of priorities. And if someone else points out that something is sexist in a novel and we don't find it sexist, then it's not necessarily saying that we are sexist, but it's saying quite often that our point of view, where we don't see that form of behavior as sexist, is because we have a different understanding of what sexism is compared to the first reader who said that was sexist. So by being able to isolate that, we can isolate what worldview that the author was accepting as a norm, whether or not it conforms or does not conform to our worldview. And so it leads to greater awareness of how we are perceiving, say, sexism in a text, because that will actually have a knock-on effect about how we perceive sexism in the world. And you know, that is one of the things about reading. Reading is a personal journey. Reading is a way to experience worldviews that are not our own. It is a way to grow and learn and understand. It is a way to see better ways of doing things, worse ways of doing things. It is a way to explore points of view that are not our own. Not necessarily that we are wrong, but it is a way of exploring different ways of perceiving the world. So why this is important is when you have behaviors that are readily replicated across lots of different forms of media in all these different narratives that all seem to obey exactly the same thing. Um, one of the examples that Philip and I discussed was a man proposing to a woman, going down on one knee and giving a ring. On the surface, you go, but that's just a standard proposal. And people will say, but that's not how you would do it in my country. We have a different sort of, if that's now cliche, that's very blah, blah, blah. Fine. But in that, why is the man pursuing the woman? Oh, well, that's just an accurate reflection of reality. Is it? Why is the man the active participant and the woman the passive recipient? Why is it not the other way around? Oh, well, that's just how it is. Why is that just how it is? What does that say about our worldview that we think that that is the right way to do something? Is it the right way to do something? And none of this is to say that men shouldn't propose to women, or women shouldn't propose to men, or men shouldn't propose to other men. Or I am not making a comment on that. I'm asking about the type of behavior that, if this is replicated and accepted as a norm, is that just replicating what is happening in society? Or is it, we just accepted it because we think this is right, this is normal? Should it be normal? And being aware that when we see behavior like that, and not talking about a proposal scene now, but when we see any sort of behavior like that, where we just accept it, this is how things function, that is quite often a signal that what is being depicted conforms to our worldview. If we don't notice these things, we never challenge the assumption that it should be our worldview. And that's why this sort of stuff is actually interesting to get to, that it's not just about the author's bias, it is about reader bias, where we project onto a text issues that we have, ideological, political, sociological, economic, our views of the world. We project onto a text because it is part of our understanding of the world. And one of the exercises that I like to do to sort of illustrate this is, why do it in literature? You don't have to do it in literature. What you can do is, if you take a news story and, to avoid controversy, usually go back about 10 years, but take a single event that is being reported on by lots of different news outlets. Take a sample of all the stories, or a bunch of the stories printed that day, from different newspapers, different online, different news outlets. Remove the banner so you don't know which article was written by whom. Put them all side by side and read them. And they are all about exactly the same event. But you will see in how they are written what information is emphasized and what information is de-emphasized, how that information is expressed, the attitude taken to these things can actually reveal a lot about whether someone has left-leaning bias, right-leaning bias, whether they are centrists, whether they are extremely pro-capitalist, whether they are wary about capitalism. That different sociological, ideological positions can all be ascertained through the analysis of the actual language, because there may be implicit or explicit bias. And the authors of these articles may be very aware or absolutely unaware of how they are framing it. And the reason we use literature for a lot of this stuff, to teach these techniques, to think about these techniques, is when you put it in a real world setting like the news, and when you start saying that X news channel has a bias, people can get very defensive because that bias is the bias that they have, and they like that news channel. So they think that you're criticizing them. And when so-and-so says that one over there, that's an inaccurate way of reporting. And they go, but that's how I would describe it. It feels like a criticism. If we move this into the sphere of literature, it is one step removed from our personal lives, and it allows us to talk about these things, to analyze these things, and develop this awareness of these different techniques in a way that is one step removed from a direct criticism of us and our worldview. That is a way of engaging with that. And that's why this is actually a fascinating area of literary study. It is not always the case that you need to be able to do this in order to understand the text. Personally, I believe that greater understanding of the text leads to greater appreciation of a text. But that is not necessary for all texts, and it's not necessary if you just want to enjoy the story. But you and I are only two people. There are lots of other people in the world who read for very different reasons and read in different ways. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that our worldview is not universal. And I appreciate that people have different opinions on this. This is something that I think is worthwhile, and I think is actually quite revelatory, not only about the text, not only about the author, not only about the time period in which the text was written and the values that that author may have unknowingly incorporated into their secondary world or their fantastical setting, but also is revelatory about who we are as people when we read. And all of those bits of information I think are useful. But regardless, your mileage on this one may vary. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support. I really do appreciate it. And so I will see you in the next one.